Hi everyone, I'm Kyle. I'm a PhD candidate in eBio. Let me share my screen. Just full disclosure, I'm home alone with two sick kids, and they're doing something, but they might come in. And I'm gonna try not to like have them come in, but if they do, I apologize. Um, so um, can everybody see my screen? Okay. Yeah, awesome.
Yep, looks great.
All right, I'm going to talk to you all about a project that Wynne and I worked on over the summer, working with wildlife disease management and how that intersects with climate change. I'll start with a little context about the project, and then we'll talk a little bit more about what we've done. Let's see. Cool. Okay, so state wildlife action plans, maybe some of you are familiar with them. I was not familiar with them before the start of the summer. But essentially, these are plans that examine the health of wildlife and prescribe conservation actions to protect these mostly species of greatest conservation need. So you'll see this acronym SGCN. I'm not actually sure exactly when this started, but in 2005, all 50 states and 5 US territories developed a swap. And then I believe that revisions to these plans are ongoing on a 10-year basis. So several states are in the process of revising their plan. And here's just a little picture of what a plan looks like. They range in content they could be from 200 pages to over 1,000 pages. Um, but typically cover roughly the same things. There's no like specific requirement. I guess there are a few requirements, but there's no specific things that people need to touch on in each state. But we're working with infectious diseases, and historically, wildlife infectious diseases are not formally included in the swap. There's no requirement to talk about wildlife infectious diseases. However, many states have sprinkled relevant infectious disease information throughout their swaps, specifically as it relates to these species of greatest conservation need or habitats that are in danger, typically of human encroachment. There is sometimes some reference to climate change as well. There's a lot of variation about how infectious disease is represented, and specifically what types of conservation action states are doing to mitigate disease, whether it's protecting animals from disease incursion or endemic situations where disease is already present in the population. And it's really cool from my perspective as an infectious disease person that more states are interested in including more granular information about infectious disease in their swaps. So I think a lot of these new revisions, we're seeing more inclusion of wildlife infectious diseases. And so just as a blanket statement, it is really, really challenging to summarize infectious disease and provide a one-size-fits-all action. I come from the human health side of things. It's similarly very challenging to do this. Things tend to be very context dependent. So keep this in mind as we move through the presentation. Part of this problem is that infectious disease dynamics tend to be very they're not static, right? They're constantly moving. They can be very context dependent. The risk of disease can be heterogeneous across different landscapes. And so an easy way or a common way to frame this is the disease triangle, which I've got here, where the intersection of pathogens, environment, and host can come together and cause disease, right? Or can come together and create susceptible populations to a certain disease. And then if you sprinkle in climate change or how climate change might be affecting the disease triangle, really all three of these different sides can have, or climate change can impact all three of those sides. So we spent a little bit of time thinking a little bit more in detail about how climate change intersects with specifically non-game wildlife disease. And we ended up binning these into two buckets. So we have the idea of external stressors. So this left column here. And this is really in the context of climate change, right? So we could see range shifts in native species. We can see changes in species abundance and density. Land use changes is a real risk factor for incursion of new disease. Precipitation changes, right? Both flooding and drought can exacerbate certain diseases, as can higher mean temperatures. So warmer ambient temperatures can also be a pretty significant external stressor. But many of these external stressors also can cause internal stressors. So if we think about the individual or the population even, right, inside the host, these can cause immunocompromising factors. Heat-related disease can really compromise your immune system as well, dehydration. Something that we initially looked at but really didn't spend a lot of time on is pollution and lead specifically in these environments that can cause some serious internal stressors to the host. And then, of course, if you've got density issues or issues with the distribution of species, we can see changes in gene flow as well. And so just to step out or to step really into the north central region, there's a few diseases that have a strong relationship to climate change that we've known about that weren't necessarily always summarized in the swaps, which we'll talk about. But avian cholera is a really great example of how drought can reduce access to clean water and can create crowding of birds and water sources, and they can be more susceptible to cholera, which is a bacteria. Hemorrhagic disease is a vector-borne disease. This little midge, Culicoides imicola, has changed in vector or in distribution. So we're seeing the vector in places where we haven't seen it before, which then makes more different populations more susceptible to disease. And then, of course, really sad, also a recent introduction to Colorado, white nose syndrome is a fungal disease. Really driven by human impact. So humans visiting caves or areas where humans typically aren't or haven't historically been can really put little brown bats specifically in a lot of danger for white nose syndrome. There's a little evidence to say that increasing temperature can also drive fungal disease, but that's a little nuanced, and we might talk about that later. Cool. So with that context, this is what we did this summer. So we started with the swaps, those action plans, and we just summarized how infectious disease was represented. And then we, in tandem, also pooled what types of language or types of language that were used, conservation actions specifically to mitigate certain infectious diseases. And then from that, we developed, or we're in the process of developing a wildlife disease action menu, right? So this is an end product for practitioners or for states working on writing swaps, just to provide some language, more granular language around infectious diseases in wildlife. Some of the methodology, nothing super fancy. Essentially, we downloaded these swaps into searchable PDFs, and really, we did try some language processing programs in Python, but ultimately the most effective way to do it was to go through and read all of the swaps in the north central region. We also included Idaho because of very similar in terrain and disease. But we searched using Boolean search, different things that might pop up related to infectious diseases, and then just recorded those counts. We didn't include anything in the literature, like references or things like, oh, organism feeds on bacteria. That's not really an infectious disease. That's just referencing bacteria. But I just want to show you a little bit of what we're working with. If you recall, they can be anywhere from 200 to 1,000 pages. And there's a lot of variation in how they're organized. This over here in Idaho shows some examples of white nose syndrome. And in Colorado takes a more specific approach, looking at one species and all the different risks to that particular species. So going through these and systematically and objectively collecting data was pretty challenging, but I am pretty proud of what we ended up with. I think we got a lot of really good information out of these that I hope will be helpful. So just to talk a little bit about how or which diseases are represented. So I'm going to kind of go by disease agent. So we'll start with viruses. But on average, well, actually, yeah, viruses are the most widely represented disease agent in the North Central region. But on average, about 8.5 different diseases were mentioned per swap. Wyoming had the most diverse representation of swaps and or of disease agents, and Nebraska had the least. You can see this breakdown. And so now we'll walk through each of the disease agents. So these were all of the viruses that were mentioned in the swaps. The most commonly mentioned virus is West Nile virus, which is a real problem, followed by canine distemper virus. And just pull out like the top mentioned agent out of interest. So West Nile virus, it has a pretty interesting transmission cycle. And so there's a lot of opportunities for climate change to exacerbate West Nile virus. And this is just a schematic from a Nature article talking about how climate change can exacerbate vector-borne disease. So we see changes in where vectors can live, specifically in this situation, mosquitoes. West Nile virus is carried by a mosquito. And that can change how humans and wildlife get exposed to those vectors, and then also can change the parasite load or viral load of a disease agent in a vector in a vector population and ultimately affect our susceptibility. So this is kind of a nice clean cut example of how warming ambient temperatures or precipitation, increased precipitation can really exacerbate disease. When we look at bacterial diseases represented, sylvatic plague, so Yersinia pestis is the bacteria that causes sylvatic plague, is the most commonly represented disease in the North Central region. But we do see a lot of talk about bacterial pneumonia and brucellosis. I don't call those out specifically, but this is a really interesting dynamic between livestock and wildlife. So the intersection between like domestic sheep and like bighorn sheep, for example, these two diseases can cause or that can be exacerbated by that contact. But just to call out Yersinia pestis is a real problem. Also, you're probably seeing a theme that a lot of these diseases have very complex transmission cycles and life cycles. But in wildlife, prairie dogs are typically a species of great conservation need, and this can greatly affect them because it's transmitted by flea. So as we talked about with vector-borne disease and climate change, I think the same principle could apply to fleas. Although fleas are a little bit different than mosquitoes. I think they're a little bit more hardy. Cool. Not much fungal disease representation, which is not surprising. We don't know a lot about fungal disease. There aren't that many fungal diseases relative to bacterial or viral diseases. So BD, most commonly mentioned fungal disease, but also white nose syndrome, which is currently in the North Central region. Recent incursion into the North Central region, and the snake fungal disease, which is very common in the Southwest. But is very much on people's radar, I think, in the mountain region as well. So BD, sorry, is Batriochytrium dendrobatus, or some people might know it as chytridiomycosis, chytrid disease. Mostly affects amphibians. There's certain amphibians that are more susceptible to the disease than others. And this all has to do with phenology of the amphibian, but also physiology. So skin, specifically keratin, can really change how susceptible an amphibian is to the disease. And this is, I had mentioned earlier about, unclear with white nose syndrome, whether or not climate change is affecting or exacerbating disease presence. Same goes for BD. Fungi in general don't like to grow at very high temperatures. Typically, they like to grow below 30 degrees Celsius. And so here you can see just a thermal optimum of BD, and that it does not grow well above 30 degrees Celsius. And overlaid with this is Rana mucosa, which is a frog. It's just showing you different mortality rates at these temperatures. So this is a great example of things being very context dependent in an infectious disease world, right? Maybe in some situations, higher temperatures might be protective to amphibians, whereas in other situations it could exacerbate disease. So really challenging to prescribe a one-size-fits-all conservation action for BD, in my opinion. Lastly, we do have some parasites that are mentioned, most commonly whirling disease. I had never heard of this before, so this was cool to learn about, and some other parasites as well. I found a really cool schematic online from someone at Montana Fish and Wildlife. What in the world is whirling disease? But essentially, it's a parasite that lives in freshwater, and when it gets into fish, can cause a lot of, I believe, neurological manifestations that result in this whirling behavior, and then ultimately death. So it's really not great, especially for trout, right? A lot of species of great conservation need are affected by this. And the link really here to climate change is that floods can really change the distribution of this parasite, but also warming water. So there is also a thermal optimum for the parasite, but it can do really well in warm water. So those are two ways in which climate change can intersect with this parasitic disease. Cool. Okay, so that's how diseases were represented in the swaps. But now, like, what are states doing or planning to do about these diseases? So we went through all of those swaps, lots of pages, lots of reading, and we started to bin conservation actions or CAs in general categories with different approaches, right? We sliced and diced these data many different ways to try to figure out the best way to capture the diversity of what's being done. And ultimately, really, a lot of states are monitoring and proposing research around infectious diseases. There tends to be very few examples of very granular conservation actions, especially in diseases that haven't yet entered the state. So a lot of the diseases that are threats to wildlife in the north central region tend to fall under monitoring and research type conservation actions. And so from these data, oh yeah, I can just talk a little bit, give you some examples here. Sorry about like what I mean by vague. So many conservation actions were like monitor the incidence of disease or track the spread of invasives and transmission of pathogens, assess and monitor, right? So nothing very specific, language that calls out an infectious disease and gives you some idea of what like should be done. But there aren't many granular examples of how to achieve that. But then on the other hand, things tended to be very context event dependent, right? We see a lot of conservation actions with sylvatic plague, specifically vaccination of prairie dog towns, and also there's a lot of literature or a lot of conservation actions around chytrid as well, so BD. So we had either really vague conservation actions or very context dependent. And after speaking with some of the states, it's very clear that they just have limited capacity to build out infectious diseases, this section in the swaps. And it's not for lack of interest, it's just really for lack of time, typically. So we felt that there was a real need to pull all of these data that we had collected and put together some sort of guidance on how to frame infectious diseases in your swap, and the types of conservation actions that other states are using that might be relevant to your situation. As we said, a lot of context dependent conservation actions. So we developed this wildlife, or we're in the process of developing this wildlife disease action menu, which kind of is a strategy-based approach. So we've created these 4 strategies based on themes from the conservation actions that we synthesized from the swaps. I won't read these, but these are really kind of relevant to different stages of disease incursion, and kind of build on the disease triangle that I had talked about earlier in the presentation. And then from this, so this is just an example of strategy 1, we have these sub-strategies that are a little bit more specific. We give some tactics, which we pulled from the swaps and also from the literature. We wanted to corroborate some of the things that were said in the swaps with the literature. And then we also give some example context where specific tactics might be used, right? And so here we talk a little bit about Mycoplasma ovis in domestic sheep and bighorn sheep, just to give people who are using this guidance a little bit of an idea of how these particular tactics might be used. And so we went through that, and we're in the process of getting feedback from states to see whether or not this type of thing would be useful or how to frame it differently. But yeah, so for the sake of time, just some concluding thoughts about my experience. It was a really great experience. This was really, really awesome. Like I said, I come from human health, so learning about wildlife infectious diseases has been really, really eye-opening for me. Um, but ultimately found that although wildlife ID has been discussed in the swaps, many efforts to do this have been very, very vague. And we think it's partly because it's just very challenging for states with minimal capacity, maybe in terms of infectious disease expertise or just time, to integrate conservation actions into the swap, and to do so in a way that is good for management plans, but also good for public buy-in, right? So some of these things might not be super palatable for the general public as well. And lastly, this idea of climate change affecting infectious diseases. I mean, there are many ways in which that can happen, and these will largely remain context dependent. So coming up with some sort of one size fits all prescription for conservation actions is going to be very challenging. And I think that's really helpful context for people working on synthesizing this stuff in the swap. Great. Just a big thank you to Wynne, also Kim, who's here from Montana Fish and Wildlife and Parks, and then also Wynne's colleagues at USGS and the CASC. It was a really great experience, and I'm happy to answer any questions that y'all might have.
Thank you so much, Kyle. That was really awesome. I think we have time for maybe like one question right now before we move on to the next presentation. But then if we have time at the end, we can circle back. So yeah, Stefan.
Yeah, thanks, Kyle. Great presentation, super interesting. I appreciate that you looked at all the different swaps and including the Northwest. That's really interesting and helpful to this kind of comparison. I was curious if you had a recommendation for next steps, taking this information that you've created, looking at this menu. If you were to say like, okay, the next step for this work that's the foundation has sort of been laid, what would you recommend?
I mean, I really think the end product, the menu that we created is will be very helpful for states, and so I'm really curious to hear the feedback from actual practitioners and wildlife biologists to see if these strategies and in particular the tactics are too broad or too vague. But it would be really great to get that document out to all the states as they start to revise their swaps in this 10-year cycle. So I think that would be really a good next step for this. Would also be great to get a little bit more literature incorporated into it and more systematically comb through the literature about what potential things people could do. For example, there's a lot of talk about releasing antifungals, particularly to buconazole, into water to prevent BD. Something that's very academic, but whether or not that's like practically doable, that disconnect isn't really clear yet. So I think that would also be a really cool direction for the project.
Great. Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kyle. That was really interesting and a great presentation. So we're going to move on to Andrew. And then, like I said, if we have time at the end, if folks have additional questions for Kyle after the other folks present, we can circle back to that. So Andrew.
All right, hey y'all. Just gonna start this up. Everyone can see the presentation, all right?
It looks great.
All right, great. New to Zoom presentations. All right. Hey y'all. I'm Andrew Veselka. I'm gonna tell y'all about the rapid climate assessment I conducted of the Upper Missouri River Breaks National Monument. So what's the Upper Missouri River Breaks? It is a national monument located in north central Montana along the Missouri River and is managed by the Bureau of Land Management. For a variety of recreational uses, you can see a lot of them on the map: camping, boating, fishing, stuff like that, as well as for science and conservation, and also for a variety of resource uses, particularly livestock grazing. So why create a rapid climate assessment? Well, monument staff approached NC CASC for support on a science plan. A science plan is a plan outlining priority management questions and the science needed for managing a unit's resources, and it's required for every national monument and national conservation area managed by the Bureau of Land Management. So it was decided that a rapid climate assessment of the monument would be useful to report on the potential impacts of climate change to the monument and to inform the monument science plan. So there were a few goals in this climate assessment. One was to synthesize historic and projected climate change in the monument. Another was to detail the effects of climate change on habitats in the monument. Also to describe the vulnerabilities of select species in the monument to climate change. And lastly, to identify where future research is needed to understand how climate change will affect the monument. And as part of this process, I actually got to go to the monument, which is super fun. Luckily, it was some of the hottest days of the year there, which is great if you're conducting a climate assessment. I wish I took a picture of the car thermometer at one point because regularly over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Down here by the Missouri River, it was definitely closer to 110 just because of all the sunlight and water bouncing off all the sunlight and bouncing off the water and rocks and all that. But so I had a great time, got to see the river, got to see a lot of the habitats on the monument, spend the night there, even got to see some cool critters. Fun fact, this snapping turtle is, I believe, either 50 or 150 miles west of the western extent of the snapping turtle range map. So we found this the morning after we were camping, and folks are currently checking whether or not this is a range expansion for this species. So just a little fun side benefit of being able to visit up there. But it wasn't all camping and catching turtles. I also synthesized a lot of climate change information as part of the assessment. So starting with what has happened so far over the last 4 decades, the monument has seen an average of 2 degrees of warming. Average annual temperatures have increased 2 degrees Fahrenheit. It's also seen a 10% increase in vegetation. In the future, no surprise, we're expecting an increase in annual and seasonal temperatures. In terms of precipitation, we're also expecting annual precipitation to increase. However, summer precipitation, if anything, will likely decrease, though as you can see, it is kind of variable there. And we're also expecting a greater interannual variability in precipitation, meaning from one year to another, total precipitation might vary pretty dramatically in the future. So what does this mean for the monument? Well, even if precipitation doesn't decrease in the summer, more heat will cause a lot longer growing season, meaning more water being taken out of the soil, as well as greater water evaporation. That means that summers, even if there isn't a decrease in precipitation, will be drier with a higher likelihood of droughts. This will lead to greater likelihoods of wildfire throughout the growing season. Also, less mountain snowpack and faster thawing from warmer temperatures will likely change stream flow patterns. You can see a graph of stream flow patterns here. This is for a gauge on the Missouri River a few hundred miles upstream of the monument, but it's still representative of how we expect stream flow to change. So you can see purple is historical conditions, and then orange and blue are both predictions under climate change. You can see how stream flow doesn't change too much in through September and winter, but then under climate change, we're expecting spring floods to begin earlier and also to happen faster and more intensely. You can see how the peaks are higher and more narrow. And then also you can see how in summer stream flow is expected to decrease. And that is a big deal for the riparian habitats in the monument. You can see riparian habitat in this picture as this green strip along the river. So stream flow, lower stream flow means a lot lower water table, which could cause drought stress in native riparian plants, which would allow the encroachment of more drought-tolerant species. Those spring floods I mentioned earlier are also important to the riparian habitat because they control for climax and invasive species that would be able to establish themselves without that recurring disturbance. And spring floods are also important because it helps to disperse and establish cottonwood seeds. Basically, cottonwoods time seed release to coincide with spring floods. That's one of their main dispersal agents. However, if spring floods happen before seed release, that means that cottonwoods might not be able to disperse as well. You can get a good picture of cottonwood dispersal looking at this picture. This is Arrow Creek. It's a smaller tributary on the monument right before it gets to the Missouri River. And in this picture, you can see younger stands of cottonwood here and here, as well as more adult cottonwoods further away from the stream. So basically, what happens is that the stream will occasionally flood, which will deposit cottonwood seeds further away from the stream, which are less likely to face disturbances like flood and ice jams while they are growing, while they're vulnerable. And then over time, this stream changes course a bit, which is why you can see that the adult cottonwoods are further away than the younger cottonwoods. And that's basically the natural pattern of cottonwood establishment. As I mentioned earlier, ice jams can influence cottonwood establishment. Ice jams, I had no idea ice jams existed until I started this project. They're really cool though. They're caused by river ice thawing rapidly and building up in a certain location on the river, usually a bend in the river where things are more likely to jam. This buildup causes water levels to rise until they break their banks, and then the floodplain is inundated with water and ice. You can see the aftermath of one of those incidents is here. Basically, all these blocks of ice scour the floodplains. It kills saplings. It scars mature trees. It creates pretty good habitat for cottonwoods for next year, but it'll also kill any saplings trying to establish. There isn't much research done on how ice jams will be affected by climate change. However, the Missouri River is expected to freeze over for the foreseeable future, and that combined with more frequent and faster thaws from warmer temperatures might mean that ice jams will increase in the future. So another important habitat on the monument is ponderosa pine forest. It covers 42% of the monument. Ponderosa pine are pretty drought tolerant. They respond to drought by reducing their growth and shifting their biomass from leaves to sapwood. This might mean that in the future, these forests on the monument have less overall biomass as well as less canopy cover, which a lot of animal species use as thermal cover. Ponderosa seedlings require a lot more water to establish themselves than adults need to survive. So in the future, seedling establishment may be restricted to wetter than usual years. As I mentioned, there's likely going to be greater interannual variability in precipitation. So it might just be those years with a lot of rainfall are able to sustain seedlings. And there's also going to be a greater likelihood of stand replacing fire just because of warmer, drier conditions. And with stand replacing fire, seedling establishment definitely becomes more important because if you don't have a stand, you need regeneration. So it's going to be interesting to see how restricted seedling establishment will be in the future, because that could play a big part in how the forests respond to climate change. Then another big habitat on the monument is sagebrush steppe. It covers 40% of the monument. Now the northern Great Plains, where the upper Missouri River breaks resides, is thought to be more resilient than other sagebrush regions to climate change. So we don't expect the sagebrush to disappear. And we actually see some possible benefits of climate change to sagebrush. They'll have a lengthened growing season from warmer conditions. Wetter winter and springs will give them more water to store for summer months. And warmer, wetter winter and springs will also provide better conditions for seed germination. However, there are minuses as well. There's going to be greater summer drought stress. The drier conditions, cheatgrass and other invasive grasses might be able to take advantage because they're more drought tolerant. They might spread more within the monument. And there's also a greater risk of wildfire, both due to drier conditions as well as fuels from invasive grasses. Fires are of an especial concern to sagebrush habitat because it takes the habitat a long while to reestablish after wildfire. I believe I was told on the monument it takes upward of 50, yeah, at least 50 years to reestablish post-fire. So it's definitely something that it's a big problem for the sagebrush steppe. So overall, we don't expect sagebrush to disappear, though they might become smaller and more numerous from these climate change stressors. And then I just want to leave you guys with some knowledge gaps I found while conducting this research. These are things I couldn't quite figure out either because I only had 12 weeks to complete this assessment or because the research just hasn't been done yet. So one of these questions how will the effect of damming upstream of the monument on stream flow change in the future? The Missouri River and a lot of the tributaries upstream of the monument are already dammed, and that's already caused a pretty significant effect on the stream flow cycle. There's just not as many of the heavy spring flood pulses as there used to be and things of that nature. Folks expect that with drier summer conditions, water restrictions will only get more restrictive. So it's an open question of how much just human water use will affect stream flow versus how much will climate change affect stream flow. Another wild card is how will increased atmospheric CO2 concentrations impact plant life on the monument. Atmospheric CO2 helps plants grow and makes them more water efficient. So it will definitely be a benefit to a lot of plants and a lot of habitats on the monument, but we're not quite sure how that benefit will play out. And lastly, as I mentioned before, with ponderosa pine forest, there's the likelihood of stand replacing fire. There's the question of how well seedlings will be able to establish them post-fire. So there is the question of how the boundaries of the ponderosa pine forest will change under climate change. So I want to end by just acknowledging a few of the people that made this work possible. David Wood for having, from what I hear, having the idea for this project, Zane Fulbright, the manager of the Missouri River Breaks, who made sure I actually got to see it, which definitely made my job easier and more fun. Jesse Hankins and Bonnie Richard, who showed me around the monument, had a great 2 days with them. And then Imtiaz and Kira, who guided me through this whole process. And with that, I'll take any questions.
That was really, really great. Thank you so much for that fantastic presentation. And I know a couple of the folks you mentioned are actually on the call. So hi, it's really nice to see you. Thanks for coming. And then I see that Bill Travis has a quick kind of comment question. He's just saying he's eager to talk later about the damming and the changed river flow regime potential. And I'll say I'm interested to hear about that too, because I think it's increasing. We're all increasingly aware that you know, there's climate change and there's ecological change, and then there's social processes, and all of those things interact, you know, in kind of all of the different ways. So that'll be really interesting to see how that bears out in the future. But David, you have your hand up.
I do. Thanks. Sorry. Zoom, not Teams, so no idea where to click.
Got it.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I guess, yeah, my question, and maybe it somewhat relates to the uncertainty or knowledge gaps slide you had, is if you have a sense of how much uncertainty there is for future climate in the monument, and maybe you could expand on that a little bit more. I think you talked about it a little bit, that there might be changes in variability, but when you think about possible future climate scenarios, how much divergence is there or possible in at least sort of the models?
Yeah. So for the purposes of this project, I kind of focused on mean projections in terms of how climate will change. But yeah, there's definitely a lot of variability with individual climate models. So I thought it best to just go with basically trends in climate change more than like how much things will change, because the trends are a lot more clear than the extent, most models predict increase in precipitation. Most models predict decrease in summer precipitation. All models predict an increase in temperature. So yeah, because I just had 12 weeks, I figured it made more sense to just go like, if it gets hotter, these are the things to be concerned about. If there's less precipitation, these are the things to be concerned about. In the actual report, I do have a table on like how different climate models expect things, kind of like the extremes, like, a more moderate one that's also dry, a more intense, the heat one that's also very wet. So I put that in for consideration, but yeah, I decided it was best to just focus on trends.
Yeah, and Andrew, please feel free to call on folks
okay,
yourself
cool.
as they're raising their hands. But yeah, Brian, go ahead.
Thanks. Thanks for the talk, Andrew. It was great. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how your work relates to the science plan, the science planning process, sort of how you kind of interfaced with it in terms of, where they're at in the science planning process, how your work might feed into it. Just curious to hear a little bit more about that. And then maybe more importantly, did you cool off by taking a swim in the river while you were there?
I'll answer the second question first. Yes, for about 3 hours at the end of the day until the temperature became bearable. In terms of the science plan, so basically the science plan is meant to instruct like scientific questions for the future, both questions that like should be answered to help manage the monument, as well as just like possible questions that folks conducting research can come to the monument to answer just for science's sake. So for that reason, the focus on knowledge gaps was pretty important for this, just seeing like where future work is needed, both for management purposes, as well as to potentially draw entrepreneurial young scientists to, study the breaks for that reason. Yeah, I'd say like there was no like direct like questions to answer for the science plan. It was more just like, here is this information to consider when like creating it. Like, here's some potential questions to ask. Here are some things you might want to look into more, yeah, that kind of thing.
Great, thanks a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions for Andrew? Can I ask a question about the turtle, the snapping turtle?
Okay.
So you said that that you found this guy about what, like 150 miles away from where you kind of expected him to be?
I mean, we didn't.
Or a lot further?
Yeah, it was like
Yeah.
either 50 or 100. Basically, like
Uh-huh.
their range extends to eastern Montana, and we were in central Montana.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so So was that, and I don't know if this is, you know, kind of for, if you know the answer to this, or maybe the other folks from that area, that if they're still on the call, but I mean, are they finding like more and more and more, or is this like the
No, that's the
lone
first
pioneer who's kind of out there?
one. Like,
Okay.
we weren't actually looking for it. We just noticed it under the boat, you know? So we weren't even looking for it, and definitely weren't expecting it either.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
yeah, like, we're not actually sure if, like, from what I understand, the monument biologist isn't sure if they've just been missed, if no one's noticed them before, or if it is actually like a range expansion.
Yeah, that's always kind of a hard question to answer. I was intrigued about the swimming question, because I was like, oh, you're gonna like swim with the
Oh yeah.
snapping turtles, huh?
Yeah. Yeah, if I think we would have noticed we took a dip the day before we found it, so I think we would have noticed it if it was there the day before.
Very likely, but still very brave.
Yeah.
Awesome. Any other questions for Andrew? Awesome. All right. Well, Andrew, thank you so much. That was a fantastic presentation. Thank you for sharing all the beautiful photos that you took
Mhm.
while you were up there. It's always really great to get in the field. And again, thank you, David and Zane. Bonnie's on. So thank you all. I don't know if I'm missing anybody else, Jesse, if Jesse's still on, but thank you so much for you know, your input and everything in this project. It was yeah, we obviously couldn't have done it without you. So really great to be able to have that partnership. And I will turn it over to Lauren.
Okay, awesome. Let's see if I can. How does that look?
I don't see anything yet, but it
Oh,
could just be a quick delay.
let's see. It says it's.
Is Zoom being feisty and giving you a like can't share message, or?
Yeah, let's see. It says it's oh, it's unable to record. It's wanting me to quit and reopen. Let's see. Is that okay if I do that? I'm so sorry.
No, you're totally fine. Tech happens. Yay. And maybe I'll just take a moment to say, you know, while Lauren is signing off and rejoining us, you know, one of the things that we really try to kind of foster and like bring about in across the RCAP projects and across all of the different projects is sort of the synergies or connections between and across those projects. So you might notice we have several projects that sort of have a geographic overlap in that they have implications for or are located in Montana. We have thematic overlaps between, you know, like this is our second sagebrush. We had two people on the sagebrush project, and Lauren's back, so we'll get to you in just 1 second, Lauren. We do see it as presenter mode, or in like your notes kind of mode. It's not full screen for us quite yet. And now we see, there we go, that looks good. But yeah, and so throughout the summer, we try to get together every other week as sort of a lab to kind of have those conversations and try to kind of foster those connections across and between the projects, and sort of keep, so kind of the whole of the projects is, you know, greater than just the sum of the different parts. So, okay, with that, I will turn it over to you, Lauren. Thank you so much. And you're muted, Lauren.
There we go. Is that working? And then let's see.
You're totally fine. I feel like I stumble over Zoom stuff at least like 18 times a day. So
Oh, and it's like the classic anthropologist who's struggling with with the
you're all
tech.
good. You sound good and we see your slides. So
Okay, awesome. All right, so sorry about that. I am Lauren Barrett, and I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Anthropology at CU Boulder. And this summer I worked on the project looking at transformations in sagebrush ecosystems. And I looked at the socio-ecological dimensions of management and conservation. And then another PhD student, Katie, she looked at the natural science side of everything, and she presented last week. So I'm not going to kind of rehash what her presentation presented, which is kind of the threats to sagebrush ecosystems and how they're related to climate change. And we both worked with Christy, Imtiaz, and Kira this summer. And so my guiding research questions: what is the social ecological context for sagebrush? What are the competing land uses? Who are the primary stakeholders and rights holders in the North Central sagebrush ecoregion? And what information do resource managers need to meet their goals in a changing climate? So I used two methods of analysis this summer, primarily a literature review of a variety of sources, but then I also had the pleasure of conducting 10 informal conversations across sagebrush with employees in federal agencies, conservation groups, and research institutions. And then federal agencies, and especially BLM, was overrepresented in these conversations. So we were interested in sagebrush. The map on the left is the historical extent of the sagebrush biome, and the right is the current extent. For the North Central CASC, we were particularly interested in Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana. And so I want to go over a very brief history of land use and management, just to kind of show how values and goals have changed over time and how that has impacted the sagebrush ecosystem in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Early homesteading and ranching practices led to overgrazing, which inspired the passage of the Taylor Grazing Act in 1936, which was one of the first steps for federal management of public lands. And then management practices post-World War II really saw sagebrush as a nuisance and tried to remove large areas of sagebrush via chains, aerial treatments, conversion to grasslands. Also prescribed fire and plowing was done. And then in the 1970s, we had the big environmental movement, and there was really a broader awareness across the United States of the interconnection between healthy ecosystems and human health. And we had a lot of important environmental and conservation legislation passed, including the Federal Land Policy and Management Act and the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, which are still very influential land management frameworks for federal agencies today. And then for sagebrush in particular, there was a continuing recognition of the benefits of healthy sagebrush ecosystems and all the different species that it supports. Specifically in the early 2000s, especially in 2010, there was recognition that sage grouse, the greater sage grouse, was experiencing big population declines and habitat loss. And so there was a lot of efforts to protect and maintain that habitat. There was also a lot of discussion about listing the greater sage grouse as an endangered species, which inspired a lot of different stakeholders who maybe wouldn't have been as involved otherwise to step in and participate in conservation efforts to prevent that listing because of its economic impacts. For example, Wyoming was estimated to lose about $1.5 to $5.4 billion if sage grouse was listed, which was at the time about 2 to 6% of its total economic output for the state. So it would have been a pretty big deal. And looking at those benefits of healthy sagebrush for communities, it supports food services from grazing and hunting. It has a significant cultural importance for communities across sagebrush, providing a sense of place and spiritual significance. Hydrologic services, cleaning water, flood control, irrigation, climate stabilization. There's a big range of recreational activities that happen in sagebrush, production of grasses and nutrient cycling, which also goes back to how it supports grazing. And then socioeconomic activities that really support a lot of rural economies like ranching and recreation permits. And so this is just a general chart looking at the primary stakeholders in sagebrush and their goals. Some of these categories like private landowners, tribal nations, NGOs, there's really a lot of diversity in those groups, but we're just trying to kind of identify generally what these groups are doing. And you can see agencies like BLM with their multi-use mandate are really working all the way across these goals of conservation, recreation, grazing, historic and cultural preservation, energy development. I'll go more into tribal nations further on. And there's an asterisk in private landowners for energy development. There is a connection between a lot of private landowners and energy development and the royalties that come from that. However, it wasn't generalizable enough for us to put that, but I wanted to just kind of mark that is a relationship that is happening. Other emerging approaches, there's really been recent efforts to create more partnerships across agencies, federal and state, as well as stakeholder groups, integrating environmental justice. This is coming particularly from federal initiatives such as the Executive Order Justice 40, which impacts all the bipartisan infrastructure law money, as well as the Inflation Reduction Act money. And then integrating climate change resiliency into decision-making. The challenges that I identified through literature and through conversation to implementing these new approaches is capacity across the board. A lot of this extra money is funding more projects and science, but it's not necessarily coming with funding for full-time employees, which is making it really challenging. Historically siloed agencies is making it challenging to address very interconnected challenges like climate change, environmental justice. And then there are disparities in public involvement across stakeholder groups. Industries such as the mining and energy industries usually have government representation in the form of commissions that are in the room with these agencies and having talks with them, whereas conservation groups, the general public, NGOs are usually left to the public comment portion of involvement. And so that creates kind of some weird power dynamics. And also environmental justice right now is viewed primarily through an economic lens. So mostly jobs created or jobs lost for these disadvantaged communities, but there is room to further implement public health metrics, cultural values, historic disadvantages as well. So some common frameworks that are being used, RAD, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard of, Resist, Accept, Direct, which is helping resource managers in rapidly changing, transforming ecosystems, particularly in climate change. So Resist, working to maintain or restore an ecosystem based on historical acceptable ecosystem conditions. Accept is allowing ecosystem to change, or directing an ecosystem towards preferred new conditions. This is kind of in sagebrush been matched with rating ecological integrity of sagebrush, often kind of referred to as Grow the Core conservation framework, where resiliency and resistance indicators are used to identify the integrity of different sagebrush areas. So trying to safeguard high quality core habitats from development, fragmentation, and other disturbances, and then restore semi-degraded habitat and direct restoration strategies towards those areas. And then the other rangeland priority areas are the most degraded habitats. And so those might be areas that you could strategically place other land uses such as energy development. And these two frameworks are just really helping resource managers, other landowners to prioritize conservation and restoration strategies as we're experiencing this rapid transformation. So this map is just, I thought it was a useful visualization of the federal agencies and then state agencies across the sagebrush biome. And you know, again, we're focused on Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana. So looking at some of the communities in sagebrush, tribal nations, this is a map of the federally recognized tribes that are within the North Central CASC region. And sagebrush is really important to many tribal nations for cultural and spiritual practices. It is medicinal and is used in a lot of ceremonies. It's also an incredible resource for agriculture, foraging, grazing, hunting. Healthy sagebrush can also provide climate resilience. And there is a lot of traditional knowledge and heritage, traditional ecological knowledge that tribal nations possess around ecological relationships, seasonal cycles, and management practices. And that's being more and more recognized by agencies. There's still a lot of work to be done to integrating that knowledge into workflows and agency processes. But it is recognized and that is starting to happen. There's also efforts to partner agencies with tribal nations. That is also just at the beginning stages. And I think there's a lot of room for growth here, but it's also, there's a long history of colonialism and dispossession. And so it's going to take a lot of time to build that trust and those relationships. There's also been some challenges around a lot of the federal mandates to consult tribes when agencies are performing any sort of action that will impact them, which looks really good on paper, but from what I heard in conversations, this is also creating a huge problem with capacity because it's inundating a lot of tribes with a lot of bureaucratic work, and that's kind of hindering their ability to then collaborate with agencies if they're kind of dealing with all this workload without additional support. So another important group is ranchers and farmers. Most of the sagebrush covering the Intermountain West is grazed on by domestic cattle, sheep, and horses. Poor grazing practices like overgrazing can degrade the landscape. However, there are studies that are showing that strategically applied grazing can have beneficial impacts like reducing wildfire risk. Both farmers and ranchers are really important for rural economies. They provision food, but they also support local services, which is really important, especially on the tourist off-season for these rural places. There's also a very strong cultural connection to ranching and farming in many rural areas, with ranches and farms being handed down through multiple generations. And this is a really cool graphic from the USDA Working Lands Initiative. And it's just showing how ranchers and farmers have really become a very important partner in conservation, particularly in the last few decades. And they're partnering with state and federal agencies to help reduce threats, such as invasive grasses and conifer encroachment. And partly this has inspired by the work to prevent sage grouse from being listed as an endangered species, but there's also a increased awareness of kind of the mutual benefits of having a healthy ecosystem and strategic grazing practices as well. Recreation is another common land use: hunting, hiking, camping, off-highway vehicle use, snowmobiling, mountain biking, fishing. this is becoming a growing concern, and there's more and more literature on it, although from what I could tell, it's still relatively limited. But in a lot of my conversations, there's really been a link between increased degradation of sagebrush and recreational activities, especially if people go off trail or let their dogs off leash, which is relatively common. But it's also an important driver of public support for conservation. For many people in the general public, it's how they're interacting with sagebrush. And so I also see this as a potential for further study to better understand those values and potentially how recreationalists can help us understand the rapid transformations happening in sagebrush, maybe identifying threats or volunteering, et cetera, et cetera. And then energy development is a big land use. Energy development and mining is a really major economic driver in all 3 states, Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana. And these projects, it's really context specific, but they do provide royalty payments. They're a major source of tax revenue for many rural areas. Sometimes these companies even sponsor civic infrastructure in rural areas, and there's a very strong cultural component in areas where local jobs are connected to energy projects. And this includes oil and gas development, mineral, coal, uranium mining, wind farms, and solar, as well as electricity infrastructure like these big transmission lines that you can see. And these can lead to direct habitat removal or fragmentation. They can also impact surface and groundwater. Wildlife can be impacted through habitat loss and indirect effects like noise, exposure to contaminants, and disturbance from vehicles and human presence. And there's always kind of, or not always, I'd say since like the 1970s, there's been this conversation around energy security and development, economic prosperity, and then kind of conservation and how those two can coexist. But more recently, renewable energy has kind of entered the scene in a big way. And especially the Biden administration has set really lofty renewable energy goals to reduce greenhouse gas and reach our climate targets. So this means that federal and state agencies, especially the BLM, are really having to balance the need for clean energy with the needs of healthy sagebrush ecosystems and the species that those support. Exurban development and infrastructure is a major source of ecosystem loss and fragmentation. This is a map of the major highways and roads. And then I just put like a subdevelopment there. And then some of the more general themes that I saw across the board, there's been such a massive amount of science and studies that have come out, which is incredible. But prioritizing which science to translate and try to apply for different stakeholders is definitely a challenge, especially in terms of capacity in NGOs and agencies. Science communication, there's a large range of attitudes, trying to understand what different stakeholders value. I heard a lot that, speaking to drought and issues of water is often a better way to approach some of these strategies than maybe speaking of it in terms of climate change when talking to private landowners in Wyoming and Montana. There is a challenge of scale. Sometimes these frameworks kind of talk at these really big scales. And so bringing that down to the local level or, the very, very local level. And imagine from the University of Wyoming, they talk about, defending your core. What does your core look like? So really speaking to those local values. And then there is an issue with trust as more collaborations are built. A lot of agency staff have noticed that, some communities do not want to work with federal and state agencies for a variety of reasons. And so they're trying to understand who they can work with that are trusted in these communities to kind of convey scientific information. And then there's also kind of this is a challenging time, but it's also an opportunity and create space for new collaborative networks that might help us adapt to the era of climate change and utilizing different people who are in these landscapes every day, especially with, a squeeze in capacity in these agencies. So maybe private landowners, recreationalists, how can those networks be built to understand what's happening on a day-to-day basis and maybe address really quickly moving threats like invasive grasses or responses to shifting fire regimes. So here's just some outstanding questions and research gaps. I think the question of what kinds of transformations are acceptable and where is a really difficult and challenging question for management and conservation. Deeper understanding of and more data on ecosystem services, but particularly climate resiliency, cultural values, and integrating the value of water and air quality benefits into agency decisions is important. What institutional expertise and workflows are needed to further integrate existing environmental justice policy frameworks, and then also a better understanding of how might climate change impact future human activities. We think a lot about how it's impacting ecosystems, but then on the human side, how might it continue to shift our energy development, where population centers are, et cetera, and then how might that in turn impact sagebrush. And then I would just like to thank the Sagebrush team, Katie, Kira, Christy, and Imtiaz for all their help and guidance this summer.
Awesome. That was a great presentation. Thank you so much, Lauren. And yeah, it's really nice to kind of see the work that you did companion, does that even work? I don't know how to say that, but in conjunction with the work that Katie did, and really looking at both the social and the ecological systems and kind of what that looks like. So yeah, questions for Lauren? Okay, well, I have one if other folks don't. I was really interested in kind of that first sort of thing that you said that was like what was it, that we need more like information on sort of what transformations are acceptable and kind of where and to whom and sort of what that looks like. And I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about that in particular. Did you see any kind of efforts to sort of have those conversations at all? Have they started in some places, or are these conversations that, managers and folks you spoke with, like, know they need to have, but they haven't kind of had those yet? Like, what does that kind of look like right now?
Yeah, I saw those conversations happening specifically in relation to sagebrush and threats. And I think Katie could probably speak to that much better than I can. But where there maybe is conifer encroachment, deciding where you want to maybe combat that and restore sagebrush or let that happen is a really challenging question, and also kind of looking at your climate models and things like that. So I think that's very much happening on the ecological side. I did not see that happening so much on the human side, but I think
that's what I was, yeah.
Yeah, and that's what kind of inspired me to think about it is, that's going to be a huge driver of social change. But we're not really sure exactly how yet. And I don't know if it's possible to know exactly how, but kind of thinking through that, especially in terms of environmental justice, I think is going to be really important.
Yeah, yeah, because that was the thing I was thinking of, because yeah, qualitative social scientist. So I was immediately thinking of like, yeah, what are different populations, different stakeholders and rights holders, different communities, across the region, sort of what their attachment to sagebrush ecosystems are, how much they like those ecosystems and like the stuff that, and value the kind of things that come from it. So like, is it the wildlife? Do people find sagebrush beautiful and like speaks to them in the same way that like big forests or mountains do, right? We have kind of like charismatic landscapes and those that get kind of overlooked and stuff like that. So yeah, I think that's a really good question that you point out, that some of these conversations are happening on the ecological level of sort of, from a conservation perspective, what changes can we tolerate to kind of keep the bioclimatic, like within the bioclimatic envelope of like what this place should look like for particular species, or, from that perspective. But yeah, from the people and the services that will still be available or not to the people, and the values that the folks that, live and recreate and own and manage and work in those places have. So yeah, I think that was a really great observation and question. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Bill has a comment. I think most folks can see it, but I'll just read it out so it gets recorded. The brief mention of the long history of efforts to eradicate or reduce the sagebrush area, including kind of the aerial stuff. Or I think Bill was the one who actually first told me about the chains that they used to like drag to kind of clear it off. And if those things are still being practiced, and how does it pay off? Like, is there actually, I think, Bill, do you mean kind of like, is there grass that we want to see, or is it just actually turning it to grass?
Yeah, I don't know if my sound is working.
Oh, it works. We hear you. Yeah, you sound fine.
Yeah. So I'd love to talk more about this, the big effort. I just wondered how effective it was after almost a century of trying to reduce the area of sage purposely through all these ways. And aerial, Lauren, interesting to hear. And is it practiced now? That's all. I'd like to follow up on that later.
Yeah, from what I understand, these practices were pretty successful in eradicating a lot of sagebrush, and a lot of ecosystems were lost. As far as these practices now, I think there's a big, I spoke mostly with the people who are on the conservation management side, trying to keep sagebrush around. But I know that there are aerial treatments that happen for invasive grasses to maintain sagebrush integrity, but I'm not sure if they've found widespread use of those practices to clear sagebrush. That's a great.
And the question about practices like that, regardless of their ecology, is the sense, especially often on public lands, often with some support, a subsidy to increase production, as you mentioned, ranching and others. The question is, do they pay, right? Is there enough knowledge to know that the effect is lasting enough to produce, say, more cows, or whatever the goal is? And I just wanted to comment on that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's an interesting question to kind of weigh that longevity and like how it works out. And I think, Bill, some of, the work that you've done with risk, and, how some of the, and, you and others have done on like federal agencies, and maybe incentivizing ag to expand in places that would be too risky without some of like the federal insurance plans or other things that might kind of attenuate some of that, potential risk that farmers and ag folks.
Well, and I hung out with a bunch of ranchers in Southwest Wyoming over a couple of summers. Mm-hmm. And they told me about their efforts to reduce, to limit sage and pinyon juniper and things like that. But then they'd often say, you know, I don't think, we kept trying. As far as I can tell, there's more of it than when we started.
Yeah. Any other questions for Lauren? All right, and I know we're almost at the end of our time, but I do want to give folks one last chance to ask either Kyle or Andrew if you have any follow-up questions for them, or for Lauren, Kyle, and Andrew sort of together in mass, because some of the topical and geographic overlaps are there. All right. I'm hearing nothing. Last chance. Oh, Stefan. Yeah.
Yeah, this might be too big a question with 3 minutes left, 4 minutes left. But I guess I was curious for any of the three that presented today, if any of the work that you were engaged with this summer sort of shifted the way you see this work, or shifted what you think is needed, or shifted like what you think you'd like to be doing in the future related to climate adaptation work.
Great question. Lauren, Kyle, Andrew.
Yeah, I have a partner here. We can answer together. But I mean, coming from human health, we hear a lot of like climate change kind of pitched in a very blanket way. And so for me to dig into it and look at different ways in which climate change intersects with disease is really helpful for me. And I definitely will incorporate what I learned about wildlife disease into my human health approach for sure. So I think it was pretty eye-opening for me just to work with the data hands-on.
I'll say just a little bit. My dissertation work is actually on decarbonization strategies in residential energy use. So I've thought a lot about climate change in terms of implementing electrification practices in like equitable ways. So this was really, really interesting on the other side to look at the impacts of renewable energy development, and you know how that also has effects, and thinking through that from the environmental justice perspective on the other side. So I'm really excited to kind of bring that more holistic perspective with me as I continue on in the climate, mitigation energy world.
Yeah, I definitely have a lot more experience with like habitat management and ecology than actual studying the effects of climate change directly. So it's more like taught me how to consider these things more than like shaped it, like it's kind of my force for array and this kind of thing.
Great question, Stefan, and thank you all. Bill, if it's real quick, go for it.
Yeah, okay. Hey, Andrew, remind me to circle back. I was surprised to learn about the National Monument. I wonder how many, what I mean to say is a BLM National Monument. I wonder how many locations BLM manages a national monument. So these would come under the Antiquities Act, right? Originally formed.
I'm not aware of the Antiquities Act, but yeah, like I didn't know BLM managed national monuments until I started this project.
Yep.
I will say I know they manage 2 in Montana, but I'm not sure how many others they manage.
Yeah, that might be good for us to know as a team. So maybe we'll have to dig into that. Well, we are almost at our time.
Sure, yeah. Bear's Ear, Bear.
Oh, you're breaking up a bit, Bill.
I'll shut up.
No, please, you can. You were just cutting out.
And Kira put Bear's Ear, maybe Grand Staircase. There's probably dozens and dozens, and it just shows how little I knew about what BLM was doing under some of the other acts. As you mentioned, FLPMA is sort of the key piece of recent federal legislation, and as also was mentioned, the Taylor Grazing Act, but the Antiquities Act has been important too, especially the Park Service, but now we're hearing about these national monuments for the BLM. Thanks for pointing that out.
Yeah, and David Wood just dropped a link in the chat that actually links us to all those. So thank you, David, for sharing that and for educating us all about that. So thank you all so much for being here today. Thank you so much, Kyle, Andrew, and Lauren, and the teams that supported you, Wynne, Kim, Kira, Imtiaz, Christy. I'm probably forgetting some other folks. But thank you all so much for the great work that you did on the RCAP this summer and for the great presentations. So thank you all.
All right, so Heoni washte mi takyapi yuha chante washte ya nape tu yu jape ye shabira simachapi malakota naha sto or malakota naha wazi ahaha el imataha ye. So what I said was, good morning, relatives. I greet you today with a heartfelt handshake. My name is Shelby Ross. I am Lakota, and I am from the Pioneers Indian Reservation, and I am a PhD candidate within the Geography Department at CU Boulder, and I have been working on the Tribal Planning Processes project with the NC CASC Tribal Liaisons, Keisner and Jana. So there are 32 federally recognized tribes in the region, the NC CASC's region. We identified 24 plans by 16 of the tribes. The title of the plans varied throughout the region. Some were climate adaptation plans, some were drought adaptation plans. And the goals of this project were to identify climate data sources and how they were applied, identify the traditional ecological knowledge if it was used, and the sources of the traditional ecological knowledge and how it was applied in the plans, as well as identify any highlights or novelty information and any information gaps. So when assessing the climate data sources, many of the tribes use NOAA or the 5th or the 4th National Climate Assessment, as well as state climate offices, and when applicable, local weather stations and peer-reviewed literature and federal reports. Many of the climate data are reported increasing temperatures, changes in precipitation, drought, and extreme weather events. Majority of the time, the climate data that was used involved like historical climate data and projected climate data for temperature, precipitation, and drought. And where it was applicable, they looked at snowpack levels and air quality and water discharge. Before we get into traditional ecological knowledge, I wanted to give a brief background on what traditional ecological knowledge is, or TEK. It involves long-term observation of ecosystems in specific regions in which the tribes have traditionally lived in close connection with for millennia. So this involves traditional stories, hunting and foraging lessons and practices, as well as long-lived ceremonial events. The sources of traditional ecological knowledge varied by tribe, and those that had elder communities established within their tribes used their elder communities and often conducted interviews with the elders. Others used community services for tribal member input of changes observed. Sometimes the Tribal Historical Preservation Office was used, which are positions of knowledge holders that know of sacred sites or oral history, or know of where or who to ask if they needed any information about cultural things. Also, each tribe has a strong oral tradition, and many have adapted TEK into classrooms in tribal school systems, and have that self-knowledge that has been passed down to them, or they've learned along the way in their lifetime. So how is the TEK used? Many of the tribal elders observed or often discussed how the seasonal cycles are changing. there are shifts in the seasons, there's drier winters, and this is really impacting the natural ecosystem cycles. So there's disruption in timing of gardening, planting, trapping and fishing, hunting, and also disruption in the timing of traditional birding regimes. Within each plan, the biggest climate concerns were often tied to how they are impacting the tribal members' livelihoods, but also how these are impacting, how these impacts to ecological resources, often tied back to cultural impacts as well. So extreme heat leads to drought scenarios, which impacts snowpack, vegetation, water resources. And then ongoing drought is a concern for many of the tribes in the region. And drought has the ability to impact every aspect of the ecological system as well. And being under drought for many years, there's always a concern about the water resources and the quality of the water, as well as quantity. Sometimes there are water limitations and there's a lack of drinking water for humans and livestock. And some of the traditional plants that were discussed in the plans include trees and wild berries. Trees like the cottonwood and lodgepole pines are culturally significant, and the cottonwood often grows by a river or a stream source. So with the drought, that's always a concern. There's a lot of berries that are of concern because they are very sensitive to extreme weather. And things like white sage and sweetgrass and mint species are also like ceremonial plants that are of concern. There are many different wildlife and fish of concern depending on where the tribe is located in the region. Sage grouse, black-footed ferret, and the buffalo are often mostly discussed throughout the plans. So culturally, I decided to include this quote that I found in the Blackfeet's climate adaptation plan. It kind of shows how ecological resources are tied into our cultures. So any loss to the ecological resources is a loss to our ability to practice our cultures and have our cultural identity. So some of the highlights include prioritizing tribal member input. So they had knowledgeable elders prioritized. These are the storytellers, knowledge keepers, and native language speakers. The Confederate, Salish, and Kootenai tribes elder interviews. These elders were 60 to 70 years old and had climate stories or climate related stories going back to 250 years before. So prioritizing climate or tribal input empowers tribal community members as experts of their natural surroundings, traditional knowledge observations, and also gives them a space to express their concerns or complaints of current BIA policies that are not serving the community. And also the input from the tribal members can highlight important culturally significant resources, which are often considered native species or rare species, and are just keep biodiversity intact and hold significance in ecological processes of their homelands. And overall, this strengthens cultural identity. Human impacts that were discussed in the plans were highlighted as well. Many discuss community infrastructure and resources as well, personal infrastructure and resources, and how the extreme heat waves are impacting their ability to stay cool, and there's a need of community cooling centers. For tribes of the north, this is also needed for extreme cold, and they need a heating source. These are causing rises in their electricity bill, and it makes them harder to keep cool or keep warm during these events. Human health was highlighted in some of the plans, but not all of the plans. or it was minimal. Many discussed vector-borne diseases like from ticks, mosquitoes, and mice. There were physical health impacts like lack of exercise, excuse me, increased potential for heat-related illness, increased potential for respiratory illness, increased potential for waterborne illnesses as well. Mental health impacts include ecological grief and having less time outside, less time with the land, less time in the community can take a toll on someone's mental health as well. There was one hazard mitigation plan that included the emergency needs for disabled populations in tribal communities. So I thought that was pretty cool, and I've only seen it once throughout the plans. I felt like the land typing mapping was a highlight of the plans that did do land type mapping, because they were able to establish what vegetation exists, ownership of lands, and where livestock lives, and if they have like conservation areas. And also it could be a way to map culturally significant resources as a way to like potentially improve those habitats for those resources. Climate change education was also a highlight of the plans. Many of the tribes are prioritizing education for all potential climate impacts within tribal communities, especially like emergency plans for hazardous weather, extreme weather, knowing who the vulnerable populations are, being more educated on outdoor and indoor air quality as well as water quality, and knowing what culturally significant resources are being threatened, as well as suggesting more sustainable living and like gardening and food sovereignty within communities as a way to combat climate change, as well as our sustainable building, like are rebuilding our infrastructure to withstand climate change. Funding sources and future collaborators were often identified in the plans, and so I felt like this was a highlight. How are we gonna prepare our tribal communities? Like, where's the funding gonna come from, and who can we collaborate with to provide the research that is needed? Information gaps include public health. Although some of the plans included some public health impacts or human health impacts, many of the plans were limited in this area. So establishing who those vulnerable populations within tribal communities are, more information on the dangers of extreme heat or extreme weather, more education on outdoor, indoor pollution, and also it was the healthcare system as a whole wasn't really discussed within these plans. Like, how is the healthcare system able to combat climate change? There is a need for more emergency systems for extreme events, as well as more data collection systems as needed. Timelines of the implementation of plans should be more included, I feel like, because we need to react fast, and having these plans in place, sometimes it takes a long time to actually implement a mitigation strategy or adaptation strategy. And I feel like there also needs to be more education around extreme weather events, especially extreme heat, and how they can impact cultural participation, because this past summer, or just a few weeks ago in my tribe, we had a young person, like 25 years old, pass away at a Sundance because of extreme heat. And I feel like that should be something that should never happen, and should never happen in a ceremonial event. And so we need more education around how this climate is changing our ability to combat heat or take on heat. And that's all I have. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Shelby. Really sorry to hear about that individual passing away. We have time for a question or two. Anyone has anything for Shelby? I think that's Molly who has a
Yeah,
hand
hi.
up.
It is Molly. Yeah, hi. Hi, Shelby. It's Molly Cross. I'm the USGS lead for the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center. Thank you so much for a really great presentation and for all your work reviewing these plans this summer. It's really great to hear your summary. I had a couple of questions. You probably said this at the beginning, and I apologize I missed it, but I was just wondering if you could remind us of how many plans did you review, and maybe like how many tribes were represented in those plans? Because I imagine maybe some tribes might have had more than one plan, since you looked at more than just climate adaptation plans. So yeah, I was hoping you could remind me of sort of what those numbers were.
So we had 24 plans that we found that were publicly available. Then they were made by 16 of the tribes.
Great. Thanks for reminding me of those numbers. And then I was curious, you were just referencing right at the end of your presentation about implementation, sort of having these plans are really valuable in terms of helping tribes focus on some priorities to move into implementation. And I was curious if you had any information or sense of how we might gather information on how aspects of these plans are being implemented. Did you get any feel for that when you were doing your project this summer, or do you feel like that would be like a next step? And do you have thoughts on how we might better understand the ways that these plans are helping to implement, projects and on the ground?
I feel like many of the plans, especially the plan that I seen are like titled climate adaptation plans. They're larger plans, so they cover like various sectors of each tribe. And within each plan, I feel like this is like a revision for like the Blackfeet and the Confederate Salish Kootenai tribes. They are on like this version where they have actually identified each concern and have a couple of scenarios of how they're gonna implement that or those changes. But I feel like they're still in like those beginning stages of going to that next step. And they also have various drought scenarios that has been developed by the drought assessment plans with the Great Plains Tribal Water Alliance. They provide like various scenarios for each drought condition and how they are gonna minimize water distribution or and things like that. So I feel like we have those plans in place, but I feel like with like actually providing better infrastructure for the communities, I feel like they could start working on that part more better.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you so much for your presentation and your work on this project. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks again, Shelby. We may have time at the end for additional questions. So if you think of something else you'd like to ask Shelby about, hold on to that thought. But I think we'll move on now to make sure we give all our presenters plenty of time. And so Haley Robe is up next. She's the NC CASC program assistant and was working on downscaling the National Climate Assessment key messages. So go ahead, Haley, I'll let you take it away.
Thanks, Christy, and thank you for your presentation, Shelby. I will go ahead and share my screen here. All right, so like Christy said, I'm Haley. I'm the program assistant with the NC CASC, and I'll be talking about the key messages from the 5th National Climate Assessment. So before I get into the RCAP, just to make sure that we're all on the same page, the 5th National Climate Assessment, or the NCA5, is part of a congressionally mandated national climate assessment series that is released about every 4 years by the U.S. Global Change Research Program. And these reports bring together teams of professionals, many of whom are on this call, to synthesize knowledge about current and projected trends in global climate change to provide an authoritative source on the state of climate knowledge in the US. So anyone can access and use the NCA5. Groups who commonly use it include federal, state, and local governments, tribes, and indigenous communities like Shelby just mentioned, NGOs and community leaders or community organizations, educators and land managers, agriculturalists, and more. And so these groups might be using the NCAs for information about local climate, projected trends, climate data, and a lot more. So just to give you a little information on the structure of the NCA5, it's broken down into the sections that are listed on the left-hand side there. For the purposes of this RCAP, we focused in on the national topic chapters and regional chapters, and I'll tell you more specifically which ones those were in a few minutes. But just a few things that I wanted to point out about this structure. First of all, this was the first national climate assessment that included an artwork and gallery section, which if you have not taken a look at, I really recommend doing that. There's some really beautiful work in there. And I thought it was an amazing connection for social science and for community. So definitely take a look at that. But otherwise, the national topic and the regional chapters are where we're kind of going to be focusing today. And each of those are broken down into a set of key messages. So when I talk about key messages in this presentation, these are not messages that I pulled from the text. They're part of the NCA5 and they were written by the author teams. And some examples of those are on the right side there. So each key message has an associated confidence and likelihood, which I don't know if you can see my mouse, but if you can, those are the slightly lighter blue color in parentheses in some of these key messages here. So for the purposes of the NCA5, the confidence is considered to be the type, amount, quantity, strength, and consistency of the evidence that's presented, as well as the consistency and ability of the methods to evaluate this evidence. And so the likelihood measures the degree of certainty of the authors based on statistical analysis of observed or projected results or on the author's expert judgment. So this is the description that I was given for the RCAP at the beginning of the summer. And the idea was to distill the really big national climate assessment and all of those key messages into a format that would be useful for a variety of audiences. Because, like I said, it's a big document. Probably not very many people have read the entire thing. So the goal was to make that accessible for people who might need the information in the document. So the project team decided to focus on the chapters in the list on the right side of the screen here. The Northern Great Plains, Southern Great Plains, and Southwest chapters were chosen because those are the chapters that correspond to our region at the NC CASC. So you can see the map of the NC CASC region on the left side of the screen, and you can see that the Northern Great Plains region for the NCA5 covers most of our NC CASC region, but Kansas is considered to be part of the Southern Great Plains, and Colorado is considered to be part of the Southwest. And we also included the water, forests, ecosystems, agriculture, and indigenous peoples chapters, because those are national topics that have a lot of relevance for our region as well. So pretty early, I was thinking about what I wanted a final product to look like. Since this RCAP is focused on making information accessible, I was sort of thinking about how we would present that along the entire process. So I was thinking of presenting the information through a web tool where a user could sort information from the NCA5 by the state they're interested in and by the topic. And this was a mock-up of the web tool that I made pretty early on in the process. On the left side was just kind of what a landing page might look like on the NC CASC website with the tool in those drop-down menus at the bottom. And on the right was kind of a sample output that would show applicable key messages for the state or region someone was interested in and a topic. So having this idea early on sort of informed how I went through reading the NCA5 and organizing that information. And I did that in a really big table here just going through each of the chapters I listed earlier, and kind of sorting those key messages into 4 different topics, which were water, precipitation, and drought, agriculture and land use, wildfire and extreme events, and people and management. So I used this table to keep track of which key messages which key messages corresponded with which of those topics. So after that, I went through each combination of state and topic and pulled out the key messages that applied. I put those into a table and wrote up kind of a draft of a summary of those key messages and some more information that people might be interested in reading. At this point, I took out the wildfire and extreme events topic just due to time constraints, but I do hope to add that back in at some point. So I have been working with Matt at Series IT to design the web tool, which I will actually show you really quick now. So you should be looking at the NC CASC website. This page on the website will be located under probably the resources tab, but it is not published right now. So if you were to look for it, it will not show up at this point. We're just seeing it through my editor view, but it's not available to the public just yet. I just put in a few items in our list here because I wanted to give you an idea of what this will look like when it's finished. But basically, when you open up the web tool, you'll see this landing page. You'll be able to go through what is the NCA5, where does the information in the document come from, learn a little about the structure of the document, and then learn about this tool and what it is covering, which is what we just went through on our other slides. So then we get to the web tool in this drop-down menu here. Every output will be listed in kind of a big, long format here, but the idea is for people to be able to sort by the state they're interested in and the topic. So let's say we're interested in Wyoming and water. We can click apply, and then we get our corresponding section here. So each of these outputs is going to have a table like this one that summarizes key messages from the chapters I listed earlier that apply to the topic in question. And this table is color-coded for historical trends, projected trends, and both historical and projected. And I'll scroll kind of slowly here and hopefully not make anyone sick or cause our Zoom to collapse. So after the table, there will be a summary that is going to go through, like I said earlier, some of those key points from the chapter and some data that might be of interest to people. I want to include a lot of maps and figures from the NCA5 as well. And again, I'm gonna scroll kind of slowly here. And the idea is to include as much state-specific information as possible. Going. And then for each output, there will be a section discussing how communities are addressing the climate changes that are outlined above. I would love to include some of the case studies that are highlighted in the NCA and maybe research and add a few more just to give people who are reading this kind of an idea of what others in their region may be doing to address some of these. So I'll jump back to our presentation real quick. As you can see, there's still some work to do to finish up those tool outputs and get that ready to be published. I definitely want to work with IT on making the text and photo size a little more consistent, just cleaning those things up. My situation with this project is a little different from our other GRAs, just because I am not a graduate research assistant. I'm a year-round employee with the CASC. So the plan is for me to continue building on this as time allows for the next couple months to get to kind of our polished final product there. But otherwise, I've been talking with the project team and a few others on the NC CASC team about some ways that we can get the web tool in front of communities that might use it. And some of those ideas were to utilize NC CASC connections with other organizations and with the National CASC to connect with the NCA5 lead authors to post about the tool on social media and in our newsletter, and to connect with extension services and strategic working groups. So for our last couple minutes here, I'm going to jump over to this Padlet. I'll put the link in the chat in just a moment. But it would be great if you had any ideas or thoughts. Feel free to discuss those in the chat out loud or to drop them in the Padlet right here. You can also list your email if you would like to be notified when the web tool is public, and any other questions or comments if we are out of time for a more verbal Q&A. But I will stop sharing. That's everything from me. There's our Padlet link, and yeah, thank you for your time.
Thanks so much, Haley. Really neat to see not only where it's at, but also the process that you use to get there. Lots of hands clapping here. We do have time for a couple of questions or comments if folks would like to ask those aloud, or Haley put the link to the Padlet in the chat, so you could also do that there if you prefer. I guess one thing I'm curious about, Haley, and this may put you on the spot, but as you were going through and categorizing things and downscaling it for the states in our region, was there anything that really jumped out at you differently, or anything that's sticking with you from going through that really detailed process of organizing the messages from the NCA?
Yeah, I think that something that kind of stuck out to me was how different author chapters sort of organize their key messages. For the Southern Great Plains, those were organized into headings like how we work, how we play, and how we heal were like 3 of the 5, which I thought was a really interesting way to kind of portray that data. And yeah, so I think that was one that stuck out to me a lot. Otherwise, themes were relatively consistent across chapters in terms of things are getting warmer, precipitation is changing, and timing is changing, and all of these things that we know to be true. I did enjoy reading a lot about some of the tribal efforts that were included in chapters. That was a pretty consistent theme as well, was how tribal communities are leading many of the efforts to adapt to climate change within communities and within the region as a whole. And yeah, I think that's kind of my initial thought there.
Yeah, thanks. I see Molly has her hand. Go ahead, Molly.
Hi, yeah, thanks. That was a great presentation. I'm looking forward to seeing the web tool and playing around with it a bit, and sharing it with our partners. I had a question one time. So I was here in Bozeman. A group of the authors from the Northern Great Plains chapter came and gave some presentations here in Bozeman. And one of the questions that kind of came up in some of the discussions was, how is this NCA 5, how are those key messages similar to, or are there any that are, notably different from the past NCAs? And I was curious, in going through the key messages, whether you would be able to pull that out from what you were sort of reviewing and summarizing and synthesizing, or if the report just didn't present enough of that kind of messaging to allow for some of that discussion in your summaries.
And so with that question, you're referring to the difference between NCA 5 and the previous? Is that?
Yeah. Sort of like, is there, like, what's really new? Like, is there anything new or different? Are we just kind of gaining greater confidence about changes that we've sort of known about for a while? you know, there was definitely just sort of some question of, yeah, like what's different here, or is there anything different, or do we, you know, continue to know what we've known for a little while?
Yeah, so I might not be able to answer that question as well as some other folks on this call, actually, since I'm not super familiar with the NCA4.
Yeah.
But from what I understand, this one did incorporate quite a bit of a community focus and maybe more of a social science focus than has been included in previous NCAs. I could be totally off with that. Someone please feel free to correct me if that's not right. Since I know we have authors from previous NCAs on here as well. But that is a really interesting question of, has our perception of these trends and projections changed at all? And that is something that I would like to look into. So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, and I don't know, I guess partly my question for you, knowing that you were just looking at the NCA 5 closely, was whether that messaging, whether any of that messaging was already incorporated into NCA 5, or if it would require sort of a going back and looking at the NCA 4 and comparing notes. It sounds like maybe a little bit more in that realm, that the NCA 5 wasn't, and again, it may have come in some places, but yeah.
Hey, Molly. Yeah, this is Aparna.
Yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I was a co-author on the Northern Great Plains chapter, and MTS was on the water chapter, so he may also have some thoughts about this. But when we start working on the NCA, we're directed to only address changes or new knowledge that has developed since the previous report. So it's meant to be just what has developed in the last 5 years. You're not supposed to retread new ground.
Thank you for that context, Aparna.
Yeah, thanks.
Well, thanks very much, Haley. And I want to just highlight Shelby's comment in the chat that she said this would be really helpful for future RCAP projects as well, to be able to sort through and find the relevant key messages from the NCA. So thank you so much for your work on this. If you have all other questions or comments for Haley, don't forget she put a link to the Padlet. Feel free to continue the conversation there. But we're going to go ahead and move on to Katie Bardsley's presentation. So Katie is with the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, and she's been working on ecological transformations in sagebrush ecosystems. So you can go ahead, Katie.
Let me just pull up my slides. Is that coming through okay for you all?
Looks great.
Okay, great. So as Christy said, my name is Katie, and I've been working on the ecological transformation project for sagebrush ecosystems alongside Lauren, who's been working on the social science side of this project. And to get us started, I just wanted to provide an overview of some of the guiding questions for this project to sort of center the work I've been doing this summer. So the first question or series of questions is, how does ecological transformation occur in sagebrush ecosystems? And what are the most critical drivers of this change? And how do these drivers interact with changes in climate? Next, we thought about, what are the current management strategies to restore or maintain sagebrush? And are these strategies likely to be effective under future climate conditions? And finally, we tried to summarize what are some of the biggest research gaps related to ecological transformation in this system, and what are some challenges for climate-informed management. So these questions sort of scope the entirety of the project from this summer, but I won't be talking today about all of these components given the time constraints. But if there are other things that you would like to hear about, feel free to ask in the question session. So what is a sagebrush ecosystem? So sagebrush ecosystems are largely dryland ecosystems where there is a cooler winter season and a lot of more cool season precipitation than warm season precipitation. And ecological integrity in the systems is dependent upon abundant sagebrush as well as the native understory. And the native understory is largely composed of perennial bunch grasses and other forbs and plant species that the native wildlife are dependent upon for food and sometimes shelter and other ecosystem services. And ecological integrity requires minimal threats from invasive annual grasses, conifer encroachment, and human modification. But when these threats are present, there's a possibility for ecological transformation. And ecological transformation is a process by which communities are altered beyond the bounds of their historic variability in ways that cannot be easily reversed. So one example of ecological transformation in this system would be when conifer encroachment sort of takes over the landscape. So in this illustration, you can see when this happens, there's the potential for the native understory to sort of recede. There's been invasion of annual grasses in this landscape, which has led to some erosion, and there's no wildlife, native wildlife to be found because the system is no longer set up to support these species. And this is just one example of what ecological transformation might look like in the system. And to provide a little more background, I just wanted to give historical context into what has happened in this biome in the sort of Western United States. So since European settlement in the mid-1800s, there's been transformation into a human-developed landscape with many non-native ecosystems. And there's been a lot of emphasis on using this landscape for grazing. And sagebrush was not recognized as an important sort of species in this landscape. And there were efforts in eradication of sagebrush in order to plant species that were seen as more economically valuable for the people who live there. So that one example of that is shown in the middle panel. But recently there's been a paradigm shift in order to preserve intact sagebrush landscapes. This has largely come up in the context of the preservation of sage grouse and other sort of umbrella species that are threatened and have been nearly listed as endangered species on multiple occasions. So there's been this sort of shift from overgrazing and not recognizing the importance of sagebrush to trying to preserve these intact ecosystems where they still are. But in that time period, we've seen a dramatic decrease in the amount of land area covered by sagebrush with nearly 50% decline. So on the left, I have a map of the historic range. And on the right, we have the current range, and you can see large declines in the sagebrush biome, especially in the sort of Great Basin area. And now that we have some background, I want to talk about, we've seen these declines over time, and we want to understand sort of what to expect into the future and how to frame management efforts. And one part of that is understanding how sagebrush is expected to respond to future changes in climate and what are different threats on this landscape. And before I sort of get into that, I want to just provide some background on what we expect in terms of climate projections for this landscape. So as has come up in both of the previous presentations in some capacity, we have pretty high confidence increasing temperatures across this landscape. And there's a little more variability in the precipitation projections, but we do have some confidence in modest precipitation increases in the northern part of the range. We also see likelihood of more frequent severe weather events, as well as increasing interannual variability. And in the context of changing water availability, we will likely see declines in snowpack with less precipitation falling as snow, as is illustrated on the left. And we expect a longer frost-free season with higher evapotranspiration rates and declining soil moisture, leading to an overall picture of less water availability for these ecosystems. So far I've sort of been talking about the sagebrush range as a whole, which encompasses a lot of the area shown here. But I want to shift gears and focus a little more now on the NC CASC region. And we'll specifically be talking more about Montana, Wyoming, and Colorado, given that those are the states where that overlap the most with the current sagebrush range. And I want to shift into talking about what we see in the literature related to plant community responses to these changes in climate. So here we're specifically thinking about increasing temperature and increasing precipitation, especially in the cool season within this range. And of course, increasing CO2 as well across this range. So I will be now stepping through various plant functional groups and what I found in the literature related to what we'd expect their responses to be to these various changes. And this table is colored by level of support for each of these findings, with the green being what I was most confident in, many sources showing these trends. Red is no confidence, there's not much in the literature on what's happening in that space. So to start with sagebrush, we see variable responses to increasing temperature. So in hotter sites, we expect decreases in plant populations, and we see increases or no changes within cooler sites. And sagebrush may benefit from increasing precipitation, especially cool season precipitation. But sagebrush is expected to have a negative response to the increased variability and extreme events. Moving on to cheatgrass, which is the most common and problematic invasive species in this context, we expect to see positive effects to both increasing temperature and increasing cool season precipitation. There's some evidence for no significant effect of increasing carbon dioxide, but I think more research is necessary in the space to draw any significant conclusions there. And in contrast to sagebrush, cheatgrass is relatively resilient to increased variability and extreme events. Moving on to native perennials, we expect overall negative impacts of increasing temperature with a shift from C3 to C4 grasses. And native perennials would benefit from increased precipitation. And we see that they have neutral responses to moderate climatic variability, but negative effects of extreme or prolonged events. And finally, pinyon and juniper are the most common conifers encroaching upon sagebrush ecosystems. And with the combined increases in temperature and precipitation from climate models, we expect increases and range shifts for these species. So just to briefly summarize the trends that I was just talking about on the previous slide, for sagebrush, there's a lot of geographic variation, but for the range, most of the range that we're considering here, there's a potential for modest increases or no change, again, particularly in those cooler and wetter northern areas. For cheatgrass, pinyon, and juniper, there's the potential for increases in population size, which would be problematic for sagebrush and other species within that sagebrush ecosystem. And for native perennials, we expect shifts in community composition with some declines depending on the species. And for all of these groups, range shifts are likely, although I will note that in some cases we're seeing range shifts already, especially in the case of cheatgrass or pinyon and juniper. But in the case of sagebrush and some of the other species, we're seeing the range contractions are currently more obvious than expansions at the leading edge. And there may be potential for expansions at that leading edge, specifically in the northern part of the range. But there are certain barriers to this expansion, and further exploration may be needed to see where there's more potential for that expansion. And I need to make it clear that there are a lot of caveats and limitations to this synthesis effort. This was a summer project. I did not have the chance to cover every single paper that's been published in this area. So this is just a summary of what I did find. And of those papers, many of these models and studies, which were a combination of like computational modeling efforts and empirical or experimental work, many of them don't consider things like disturbance, elevated carbon dioxide, species interactions and invasion, the indirect effects of changes in climate, and or extreme weather events. Or some of them aren't explicitly focused on the regions that we're interested here at the NC CASC. So many of them are range wide. Some of them are focused more in the Great Basin because some of this transformation is happening at a more rapid rate in that area. And some of them are, for example, like greenhouse experiments or growth chamber experiments that are not specific to a certain geography. So there were some generalizations made when other information was not available. But there were still some key themes that did come out from this work, despite all of the limitations. And one of those is that climate change alone likely what drives future sagebrush degradation. Invasion, wildfire, and their interactions with climate change will likely be more threatening. And aside from invasion, wildfire, and these climate changes, there are other drivers of ecological transformation in the system, including conifer encroachment, human development, and wild horses and burros. And all of these interact with each other in climate change. Some are more of an issue in certain regions than others. I don't have time today to go into detail on some of these other topics, but they were part of this larger synthesis effort. And finally, I just wanted to briefly bring up some of the outstanding questions and research gaps that were identified as part of this synthesis effort. So one major question here is, what kind of transformation is acceptable in these rapidly changing systems? How do we navigate all of those limitations I brought up when I was talking about the sort of climate response synthesis effort? There's a lot of limitations, but the models can only incorporate so many different things when projecting vegetation responses. So how do we interpret and navigate that uncertainty? Are there key non-climatic differences between the western and eastern parts of the biome? So we see that some of these changes are happening more rapidly, or they're in a more they're further along in the western part of the biome. And we want to sort of consider what's happening in the west as we think about management in the east. But I'm curious if there are sort of land management or historic differences that maybe help inform the changes we're seeing, or the differences between the different parts of that biome. And then how might woody encroachment dynamics change with the changing climate? That was one area where the research wasn't as deep. So I'm curious to sort of understand that more thoroughly. And then cheatgrass is the predominant invasive species that came up in this space. But with changing climatic conditions, will there be other invasive species that become more problematic in this system? And with that, I'd like to thank the Sagebrush NC CASC team, especially Lauren, Kira, Christy, and Imtiaz, and the various experts who took the time to speak with Lauren and I about their work. With that, I'll take any questions you have.
Thank you so much, Katie. Really great. Angela, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Great presentation, Katie. So I work at Colorado Parks and Wildlife, and we are working on our state wildlife action plan update right now. And the climate vulnerability of different habitats is definitely a focus of that. And so you did mention, I think at the top, perhaps summarizing some management actions that you found during this work. I'm just wondering if in the final report, if there's much in the way of sort of management actions in response to some of these, transformative processes. Just curious how much there might be in there.
Yeah, I definitely did a lot of reading on current management strategies, but I think the sort of how these management strategies how effective they will be under future climate conditions is an outstanding question that isn't fully resolved. So I think I did do a decent dig into the management side of it, but I think part of that raised more questions than answers at this stage.
For sure. Okay, thanks. That's helpful.
One question that I had, Katie, you're highlighting the difference between the relatively warmer areas and relatively cooler sites for sagebrush, and that it might respond differently. Do you have a sense, or can you give us a sense for how big those ranges are? Are there a lot of places that are sort of cool sites that sagebrush might benefit or not be affected from the change in temperature? Or just wondering how those areas compare to each other.
Yeah, I think in the NC CASC region, there are more of those cooler sites, especially in Montana and Wyoming. But I think range wide, there's a lot of potential for the potential for declines. So depends on sort of the geographic context you're thinking about. It's definitely more of a concern in the Great Basin in terms of the projected declines.
Yeah, thank you. Go ahead, Megan.
Thanks, Katie. I had a question about if you felt like you kind of found out what the major trajectories would be for sagebrush. Like if there was, how much, I guess my real question is like, how much of the loss of sagebrush that you showed from that Nature Conservancy figure is due to urban expansion versus cheatgrass versus pinyon juniper? Do you have a assessment of that or some sense?
At this point in time, it seems like cheatgrass is the biggest threat that sort of experts in the field have identified as the main focus that we need to think about in terms of future sort of transformation. I think one of the questions I have, partially related to the western and eastern parts of the biome and land use history, is I think for me the transformation into human dominated landscapes or energy type uses came up, but not in as high as magnitude as cheatgrass type threats. But I wonder if historic land use types of things did impact that. Maybe that was more of a problem historically, but at this point in time, it's cheatgrass that has shifted to be more of the focus. And I think there is some geographic variation too, because when Lauren and I were speaking to various stakeholders, there were some differences in what people were identifying as common problems. And I think part of that was regional variation in the specific landscapes they were working on. But it seems that, at least in what's published right now, that cheatgrass is the primary concern looking into the future, especially as cheatgrass amplifies fire cycles and it just a lot of interacting effects. And that land use is maybe less of a concern right now, but that doesn't mean it isn't a factor.
Thanks again, Katie. Really great presentation.